With the hundreds or thousands of pieces of environmental legislation, laws, policies, regulations, and as many environmental agencies and organizations as there are in the United States, you might think we had this conservation and sustainability thing down. And we've come a long way from where we started. But our recent score in the International Environmental Performance Index is 71%. It's a C-. In some categories, a D-. And the US is ranked number 27 in the world in overall environmental performance. Isn't America number 1? When did we switch the chant to we're number 27? Even with all our development and laws and efforts, why do we still struggle to be global leaders in environmental quality? What are the biggest challenges to effective environmental protection? Existing research on this question is limited almost entirely to the private sector. Like, why do businesses and industries have a difficult time implementing sustainability initiatives? Valuable, but this is not the extent of the question. What are the challenges across all sectors? Private, public, and nonprofit. What barriers do the enforcers run up against when they're trying to do their job? Or the innovators? Or the policymakers? Or the conservation specialists? Or the businessmen? Or the average citizen? This research is limitless, but exploring this question can orient us to creating a realistic, feasible, and effective environmental protection effort. My name's Danielle, and I extended this question to dozens of environmental agencies and organizations, federal, state, non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, and private businesses. I actually conducted interviews with a lot of representatives and wonderful people from agencies including the Department of the Interior, the Environmental Protection Agency, state legislatures, enforcement agencies, public lands agencies, oil and gas companies, research groups, conservation nonprofits, and more to ask the question, what are the barriers to effective environmental protection that you have found in your work? The answers varied and are probably limitless. But interestingly, 3 major themes seem to emerge. Parts 1 and 2 of this project will explore these themes in their own words. And we'll hear what the 3 major challenges are across the board to protecting the environment. From this question, an unintended second research question naturally emerged. What are the best approaches you've found in your work for effective environmental protection? Again, the answers varied, but again, and unintentionally, 3 major themes emerged. For those of us wanting to do more to protect our resources than change our light bulbs, minimize beef, and vote, parts 3 and 4 of this project cover the 3 best approaches to making a substantial difference in environmental protection directly from the mouths of the environmental protection specialists from a variety of niches and expertise. Equipped with these insights, we can take an educated approach to creative problem solving, policy design, enforcement procedures, sustainability initiatives, productive conversation, and the ultimate goal of effective environmental protection. What specifically is the problem? What specifically is the solution? Can we take and consolidate decades of experience across a spectrum of experts into a digestible initiative for effective environmental protection? Let's start with the barriers as the experts see them, in their own words. The first of the 3 major barriers to effective environmental protection is enforcement issues. We can have all the administrative environmental protections we want, but they don't mean a thing without enforcement. Let's get into why.
In many places where we work, often in the forest in these remote areas, these are in countries, there are governments, there are policies that are supposed to be enacted there, but there's no one actually there to enforce them. And so in many ways, policy itself doesn't make a difference when there's no one who's actually taking responsibility for it. But policies themselves can be useful. And so in many ways, even if the police themselves aren't able to respond, even if the local people cannot rely upon law enforcement to actually make a difference, they can actually be the ones to take responsibility for it. So in many ways, we're able to use the fact there is a policy to work with local groups, pull them together, have a mandate to actually stop illegal logging in an area. So policy itself, while very important for establishing who has sort of the mandate to make a difference, ultimately it's up to local people who are effectively law and order agents in these areas to take these things into their own hands.
A leading reason enforcement is inadequate is the lack of enforcement resources, whether that's staff, time, funding, will, capacity, or even hesitation around real physical danger.
The problem is also the fact that there is a lack of enforcement. So many of those policies are implemented, but not so well. And then internally, there is a lack of capacity, a lack of staff, and that is, of course, linked to the lack of political will and the lack of finance. But at the end, this is what is missing.
The biggest issue was there was a lack of enforcement. We only had one guy to cover 400,000 acres by himself. So he would tell us that, there's certain things that we just can't enforce because he's too busy. He's like in a town completely in the next door, and he's not going to get there for another 4 hours. So there was a big lack of commitment in terms of law enforcement because of our just lack of funding and just how big our district was.
One of the major problems we had was someone running the enforcement program who didn't want to enforce the law. And the consequence was that they spent all their time inspecting people they knew were in compliance, so they never had to do anything. The bad actors were the ones that were never inspected because it took a lot of time to find them, because they were always gone whenever you tried to find them.
Another issue enforcers face is the challenge of plain language. Some of these regulations are written so formally in legalese. They don't set you up for success, either to follow them or enforce them confidently.
The other challenge is clarity. In other words, are the regulations clear on what is and is not expected of a particular discharger? And you can start with the Clean Water Act. Is that clear enough? And you can boil it all the way down to the permit language. Is that clear enough? And then I'd say one step further. How clear is that permit language to the person implementing that permit? One of the challenges for our agency is you've got two different constituencies that you're trying to satisfy. You've got every time we do an enforcement action, it's challenged by lawyers, it's held up in court, it goes through court. So then we try and write permits that are more prescriptive, more detailed, more lawyery, if you will. And the downside to doing that is then we lose the general audience and the mom and pop industrial operators that are just trying to follow, well, what am I supposed to do here? This permit makes no sense. Give me a lawyer to translate it. If we lose clarity, the expectations are not effectively conveyed and not followed through on.
Consistently in all of my work, the biggest barrier to environmental protection and enforcement has always been an understanding of the regulations. Congress does not write the clearest laws, and the rulemaking process for agencies to implement those laws is very challenging. There's a lot of stakeholders, there's a lot of conflict in that process, and the regulations that we end up with are not always the most clear, and they require years and years of clarifying guidance before they can really be effectively implemented. And sometimes they require congressional changes that can take years to process before there's a clear rule in place for environmental protection.
Something not many people think about when it comes to enforcement is the ethical dilemma of risk assessment. What happens when it would do more harm than good to bring heavy equipment in to clean up an area than to just leave the pollution? Do you drive a bunch of heavy machinery into the wilderness and tear it up to get to an oil spill? Maintaining environmental quality isn't as simple as protect the environment, period, end of statement. There's an ethical question around the most effective ways to protect and prioritize the environment.
In some locations along the bay, there's been a lot of contamination due to shipbuilding activities and Navy activities, and some of that pollution has been there for many years, before there were environmental regulations. So they weren't in violation of the law or anything like that. There weren't environmental laws back then. And so So some of those contaminants they're legacy pollutants, and they're present in the sediment in the bay. And it's a little difficult because it's like you can remove the sediment, but at the same time you're gonna disrupt habitat by doing so. So you got to figure out if it's worthwhile to take it out.
And how about turnover? An environmental specialist in the public sector retires or is promoted and takes all their experience and little insights and connections with them. Or new managers or startups come into the private sector and they don't have the knowledge of dealing with this aspect of their new position, or even realize they have to.
I would say motivations for environmental enforcement issues really runs the gamut of a lot of new people in the industry, people who are brand new, and all of a sudden the knowledge gap from the employee that retired with 30 years of experience and that information never got passed on. Those, I would say, are the most common.
Basically, the big corporations are there with longevity, so they know the laws and they continue to implement the laws. But with mom and pop shops, like we get metal scrap yards, they turn over, they open up and they close down, and they open up and they close down. So every couple of years, you're educating a new group.
Finally, for this first barrier, the lack of enforcement can come straight from a lack of jurisdiction. We're at a total loss for how to maintain environmental quality if we don't have the authority to enforce environmental standards across countries. Our neighbors aren't subject to our national laws, but we do share resources. How do we bring them to the table and find creative solutions when we don't have the authority?
The international border was not drawn along the watershed line, and water does not respect political boundaries or acknowledge political boundaries. It's outside of our comfort zone when we're dealing with the Tijuana River watershed, because we look in our toolbox and there's nothing that's really going to work if we don't have any authority, if we don't have any jurisdiction in another state, let alone another country. And so we have to come up with creative ideas.
The last two themes of this barriers to effective environmental protection question are explored in part 2. And best approaches to overcoming these barriers are in parts 3 and 4. Keep it going.